I stood in the corner of my family's glittering mansion in Naperville, watching my brother Mason raise his champagne glass as the countdown to midnight began. His arm wrapped possessively around Riley's waist, his smile sharp and cruel as a knife. The crystal chandeliers above us sparkled like 1,000 false promises, and the crowd of relatives and business associates waited for his toast with eager anticipation. 10, 9, 8. Mason's voice cut through the music, loud enough for everyone to hear. He pointed directly at me, his finger like an accusation. "Look at my sister over there. 33 years old, no husband, no kids. She's probably a lesbian, right? That's why men run away from her." 7, 6, 5. Laughter erupted around the room. I watched my mother Valerie's lips curl into a satisfied smirk. My father Gregory nodded approvingly, as if Mason had just delivered the punchline to a joke they'd all been waiting for. The business partners chuckled politely, their eyes sliding over me with mixture of pity and contempt. 4, 3, 2. I lifted my glass to my lips, letting the expensive wine touch my tongue. My hand didn't shake. I had learned long ago not to give them that satisfaction. But something inside me had finally crystallized into diamond-hard clarity. This was the last time. The very last time I would stand in this room and let them treat me like I was nothing. 1. Then Riley stepped away from Mason's embrace. She walked to the centre of the room where the microphone stood, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the precision of a metronome. Mason's face lit up, thinking she was about to praise him in front of everyone. The fool. Riley's voice was clear and cold when she spoke into the microphone. "You're right about one thing, Mason. Harper doesn't need a man like you, and I'm not your girlfriend." The massive LED screen behind her, which had been displaying our family photos all evening, went black. Then it blazed to life in crimson red with words that made my heart soar, evidence of crimes committed by Mason Ellison. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we got to this moment, how Riley and I orchestrated the most beautiful revenge I could have imagined, I need to take you back 6 months. Back to when I still believed my family might love me if I just sacrificed enough. If you want to see how a woman rebuilding her entire life from ashes and taking down everyone who wronged her, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me if you've ever had to cut off toxic family members. Because trust me, this story is about to get wild. 6 months earlier, I sat in the conference room of North Peak Media, the company I had built from nothing, with my best friend and business partner, Riley Vaughan. We'd started in my studio apartment 5 years ago, with nothing but laptops ambition and a shared vision of creating content that actually mattered. Now we had 40 employees, a sleek office in downtown Chicago, and revenue projections that would hit $7 million by year end. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I was watching my entire world crumble because my parents had just walked through the door with Mason trailing behind them like a spoiled prince. My father, Gregory Ellison, looked every inch the successful corporate attorney he was, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit custom-tailored on Savile Row. My mother, Valerie, wore a Chanel dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And Mason, my older brother, by 3 years, wore the same smug expression he'd perfected since childhood, the one that said the world owed him everything simply for existing. "Harper, darling," my mother said in that saccharine voice she used when she wanted something, "we need to talk about Mason's future." Riley sat beside me, her hand instinctively moving to cover mine under the table. We'd been friends since college, and she could read my tension like a book. "This is a closed meeting," she said firmly. "We're discussing quarterly projections." "This won't take long," my father interrupted, already pulling out a chair. "He didn't ask permission, he never did. Mason needs a position in your company, creative director would be appropriate." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, then at Mason, who was examining his fingernails as if this conversation bored him. "Excuse me." "You heard your father," my mother said. "Mason has been between opportunities for quite some time now. It reflects poorly on the family, people are starting to talk. Between opportunities. That was the polite way of saying Mason had been fired from 3 jobs in 2 years for incompetent sexual harassment complaints, and in one memorable instance showing up drunk to a client presentation. But my parents had always been masters at rewriting reality to suit their needs. "This is my company," I said quietly. "Riley's and mine. We built it. Mason has no experience in media production." "He has an MBA from Northwestern," my father countered, "and family should support family Harper. Surely you understand that concept." The guilt, always the guilt. It was their favourite weapon, honed to perfection over 33 years. I'd spent my entire childhood being reminded that I wasn't the son they'd wanted, that I'd disappointed them by being born female, that everything they gave me was an act of charity I could never repay. "We'll need to think about it," Riley said, her voice carefully neutral. "We have a board to consult." My mother's eyes narrowed. "Actually, Harper, there's something else we need to discuss. That student loan from your undergraduate degree, the one we co-signed for you." "I'm Nancy." My blood ran cold. I knew where this was going. "We've been reviewing our financial obligations," my father continued smoothly. "We're considering calling in that debt. Of course, if you were willing to help your brother, we could forget about it. Family, helping family. $50,000. That was what they held over my head. I'd been paying it down slowly while building the company, but my name was on that loan alongside theirs. If they decided to make my life difficult, they could. They absolutely could. I looked at Riley, saw the fury in her eyes, the way her jaw clenched. But she gave me the tiniest nod. We both knew I had no choice. Not yet. "Fine," I heard myself say. "Mason can start next week." The smile that spread across my mother's face made me feel sick. Mason finally looked up from his phone, his expression triumphant. He knew he'd won. He always won. After they left, Riley grabbed my arm. "Harper, we can fight this. We can get a lawyer." "With what money?" I asked bitterly. "Everything I have is tied up in this company. And you know how good my father is at legal manipulation. He'd drag this out for years, ruin my credit, make it impossible for us to get additional funding. So we just let Mason walk in here and destroy everything we've built." I looked at her, then really looked at her. Riley had given up a comfortable job at a New York advertising agency to join me in this venture. She believed in me when no one else did. She worked 16-hour days, survived on ramen noodles and coffee, celebrated every small victory, and mourned every setback right alongside me. "No," I said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "We let him think he's destroying it, but we're smarter than he is, Riley. We're smarter than all of them." The next 3 months were hell. Mason showed up late every day, usually around 11, reeking of expensive cologne and entitlement. He immediately started undermining me in meetings, talking over me, dismissing my ideas in front of clients. When our lead designer presented a campaign concept I'd spent weeks developing, Mason claimed he'd come up with it and presented it to our biggest investor as his own work. The investor loved it, loved him. Mason had that gift, the same one my father possessed, the ability to charm people, to make them believe his lies. He'd learnt from the master. I watched him harass our female employees, making inappropriate comments about their appearance, standing too close, touching their shoulders and backs without permission. 2 of them came to me in tears, asking what they should do. I told them to document everything, every incident, every witness. I started my own file. Mason created what HR professionals call a toxic work environment. He played favourites, pitting team members against each other. He took credit for others' work and blamed them for his failures. He scheduled meetings at impossible times just to prove he could, just to watch people scramble to accommodate him. And through it all, my parents called regularly to remind me how grateful I should be that Mason was lending his expertise to my little company. How lucky I was to have such a supportive family. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I'd discovered irregularities in our finances, money missing from accounts that only Mason had access to. When I confronted him in the glass-walled conference room with Riley and our CFO Lauren present as witnesses, he didn't even try to deny it. "So what?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "It's family money anyway. Dad always said half of everything you have should be mine." "This is embezzlement," Lauren said, her voice shaking. "I have to report this." Mason stood up so fast his chair rolled backward. In 3 strides he was in front of me, and before I could react, his hand connected with my face. The slap echoed in the silent room. I tasted blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. Riley was already on her feet, phone in hand, but Mason grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises. "Listen to me, you ungrateful bitch," he hissed. "You're just the worker ant. I'm the face of this family. If I say you're crazy, then you're crazy. If I say you stole that money, guess whose story Dad will make stick in court?" He was right, and we both knew it. My father had connections throughout the legal system in Illinois. He'd built a career on knowing which judges played golf at his country club, which prosecutors owed him favours. After Mason left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass, I sat in that conference room with Riley and Lauren and realised the full extent of my situation. Lauren pulled up the financial records with shaking hands. "It's worse than we thought," she said quietly. "He's been transferring money to offshore accounts. And Harper, your signature is on the authorization forms." "That's impossible, I never signed anything." "I know you didn't, but it's your signature. He must have forged it, probably traced it from other documents." Riley's voice was deadly calm when she spoke. "So if the company goes under now, if this comes to light, Harper takes the fall." Lauren nodded miserably. "The paper trail all points to her. Mason made sure of that." I felt something break inside me then, but it wasn't my spirit. It was the last fragile thread of hope that my family might ever see me as anything other than a tool to be used. It was the final death of the little girl who'd spent years trying to earn her parents' love. "Okay," I said, "then we don't let it come to light, not yet." I went home that night to the apartment I shared with 2 roommates, the tiny space that was all I could afford while I poured every dollar into the company. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, at the bruise blooming on my cheekbone, the split in my lip. I took photos, documented everything, just like I'd told my employees to do. Then I called Riley. "I need you to do something crazy," I told her. "Something that might blow up in our faces, but I think it's the only way." "I'm listening." "I need you to seduce my brother." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Riley started laughing, a sound that was half hysteria and half grim determination. "Tell me the plan." We worked through the night, the 2 of us huddled over laptops in a 24-hour diner, drinking terrible coffee and plotting. Riley had skills I'd never needed to tap into before, remnants of a past she rarely talked about. She'd worked in corporate intelligence before going into advertising. She knew how to create false identities, how to manipulate social media profiles, how to become whoever she needed to be. Over the next 2 weeks, Riley transformed herself. She created a new identity, Riley Vaughn, daughter of a Texas oil magnate, independently wealthy, looking for investment opportunities in Chicago. The backstory was airtight, complete with social media accounts that had been carefully aged photos at charity galas mentions in society columns that Riley had somehow managed to plant. She changed her appearance too. Gone was the practical ponytail and minimal makeup of my business partner. This Riley wore designer clothes that showed off her figure, had her hair professionally styled, carried herself with the easy confidence of old money. She was stunning, and she knew exactly how to use it. The trap was set at a networking event at the Peninsula Hotel. I stayed home, playing my part as the defeated younger sister, who'd finally learned her place. Riley walked into that ballroom like she owned it, and Mason never stood a chance. I watched it all unfold through the photos Riley sent me. Mason approaching her at the bar, Riley laughing at something he said, touching his arm. Mason puffing up with pride, thinking he'd landed a prize. By the end of the night, he'd given her his number and asked her to dinner. "He's even more pathetic than I thought," Riley texted me. "This is going to be almost too easy." But it wasn't easy, not really. For the next month, Riley had to spend nearly every evening with my brother, laughing at his jokes, listening to his bragging, pretending to be impressed by his lies. She had to let him kiss her, had to dodge his increasingly aggressive advances, while keeping him hooked on the possibility. Meanwhile, I played my part at the office. I became quiet, subdued, the broken woman everyone expected me to be. I let Mason take over more and more of the company's public face. I retreated to the background to the actual work of running the business, and I let everyone think I'd been beaten. My parents loved it. They called to tell me how proud they were that I'd finally learned to support my brother, how much more successful the company was with Mason's leadership. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. In reality, I was working 18-hour days, cleaning up Mason's mistakes, maintaining client relationships through back channels, keeping the company afloat while he played CEO. And I was gathering evidence, every forged signature, Every misappropriated fund, every inappropriate email and text message, I documented everything. Riley's performance was Oscar-worthy. She played the role of adoring girlfriend perfectly, encouraging Mason to show off, to brag, to reveal all his secrets. She got him talking about his gambling addiction, his sports betting that had spiraled out of control. She discovered he'd withdrawn $200,000 from the company's payroll account to cover his losses. "He thinks I'm too stupid to understand business," Riley told me one night, exhausted after another dinner with Mason. "He actually explained to me how he was forging your signatures like it was some clever trick he was proud of." "Did you record it?" She held up her phone, a grim smile on her face. "Every word." The really dangerous moment came in early December. Mason showed up at Riley's apartment, drunk and aggressive. She'd been downloading files from his laptop using a keylogger she'd installed during one of their dates. When she heard his key in the lock, she barely had time to close the laptop and delete her browser history. She texted me from the bathroom, "He's here." Unplanned, I had to distract him. My heart stopped. For 20 agonizing minutes I didn't hear anything. Then handled, got what we needed, never doing that again. I found out later that she'd pretended to be in lingerie, had staged a seduction scene to distract him from the laptop sitting open on her couch. The things she'd sacrificed for this plan, for me, for our company, I could never fully repay. But the evidence kept mounting. I'd reconnected with Lauren, our former CFO, who Mason had fired when she'd started asking too many questions. She was furious, ready to help. Together we reached out to a contact she had at the IRS, a special agent who specialised in corporate fraud. "You need to understand," Agent Patricia Morrison told us in a quiet meeting at a restaurant in Evanston, far from anyone who might recognise us. "The IRS doesn't play games. If we investigate and find evidence of tax evasion, money laundering, wire fraud, we will prosecute to the fullest extent of federal law. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the bruise on my face that had finally faded. I thought about the years of being told I wasn't good enough, of watching Mason fail upward while I worked myself to exhaustion. I thought about the employees who'd quit because of the toxic environment he'd created, the dreams he'd crushed because he needed to feel important. "I'm prepared," I said. Agent Morrison nodded slowly. "Then get me everything you have. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence. And understand that once this starts, there's no going back." December 20th. I got the call I'd been waiting for. My mother, her voice dripping with false sweetness, invited me to the family's New Year's Eve party. "Mason wants to make an announcement," she said. "Something wonderful for the company's future. We'd like you to be there, Harper. Despite everything, you're still family." I knew what the announcement would be. Riley had already told me. Mason and my parents had found a buyer for North Peak Media, a larger corporation that wanted our client list and our reputation. They were planning to sell the company out from under me, take the money, and leave me with nothing. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They were going to make me watch as they signed away everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed for. They were going to do it at a party in front of everyone to humiliate me one final time. "I'll be there," I told my mother. I wouldn't miss it. Riley and I spent the next week finalising everything. We coordinated with Agent Morrison, with Lauren, with a lawyer who specialised in corporate fraud cases. We had copies of every document in multiple locations. We'd informed the company's board of directors, the real investors, who'd put money into North Peak Media based on my work, not Mason's lies. And we prepared the presentation that would play on the mansion's LED screen. The night of the party, I dressed carefully. A simple black dress, elegant but understated. I wanted to look like I belonged there, but I didn't want to outshine anyone. Not yet. I drove to Naperville, to the gleaming mansion in the wealthy suburb where I'd grown up, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The house blazed with light music spilling out into the cold December air. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway. I could see through the windows to the glittering crowd, inside all the people my parents wanted to impress, all the witnesses to my planned humiliation. I walked in alone. Riley was already there on Mason's arm, playing her part for the last time. She caught my eye across the room, gave me the slightest nod. Everything was in place. The hours crawled by. I stood in my corner nursing a glass of wine, watching the party swirl around me. People who'd known me since childhood looked through me like I was invisible. My parents held court by the fireplace, accepting congratulations for Mason's success. The success that was actually mine. My brother was drunk by 10 p.m, loud and boastful, telling anyone who would listen about his genius business strategies. Riley stayed close to him, her face a mask of adoration. I wondered if anyone else could see the steel beneath her smile. At 11:30, my father clinked his glass for attention. The crowd quieted, turned expectantly. This was it, the moment they'd all been waiting for. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Gregory Ellison said in his courtroom voice. "We're here to celebrate not just the new year, but a new chapter for our family's business success." He gestured to Mason, who swaggered to the front of the room with Riley on his arm. The representatives from the acquiring corporation stood nearby, contracts in hand, champagne glasses ready. "My son Mason has done extraordinary things with North Peak Media." My father continued rewriting history with every word. "He's transformed a small startup into $1 million enterprise. Tonight we're thrilled to announce that Sentinel Media Group will be acquiring North Peak, recognising Mason's vision and leadership." Applause, my mother beaming, Mason grinning like he'd won the lottery. The contracts were brought forward on a silver tray, fountain pens arranged artfully beside them. And then the countdown began. 10 seconds until midnight, until the new year, until they stole everything from me. That's when Mason pointed at me and made his joke about me being a lesbian. That's when the laughter erupted. That's when I stood there, glass in hand, and let them think they'd broken me. That's when Riley stepped away from Mason and walked to the microphone. I watched my brother's face as she spoke, as she told him she wasn't his girlfriend. Confusion first, then anger, then the dawning realization that something was very wrong. The LED screen behind her went dark, then blazed red with those beautiful words. The presentation began. Every slide we'd carefully prepared, every piece of evidence we'd gathered over 3 months of careful planning. The screen showed Mason's gambling accounts, thousands of dollars flowing from company funds into online sports betting sites. It showed the forged signatures my name traced over and over, authorizing transfers I'd never approved. Then came the videos. Riley had been so clever, her hidden camera work impeccable. There was Mason drunk and bragging about how he'd fooled everyone. There was Mason explaining how he'd manipulated the books, how he'd set me up to take the fall if anything went wrong. There were clips of him harassing employees, of him screaming at interns, of him being exactly who he was when he thought no one important was watching. The final slides showed email chains between my parents and Mason discussing how to maintain the illusion of his success. My father giving advice on how to manipulate legal documents. My mother suggesting ways to keep me compliant and afraid. The silence in that room was absolute. I watched the colour drain from the Sentinel Media representatives' faces. I watched them look at the contracts in their hands like they were radioactive. The senior VP tore his copy in half, dropped it on the silver tray, and headed for the door. "We'll be in touch with our lawyers," he said coldly to my father. "This deal is dead." Mason finally found his voice. He lunged toward Riley, fury twisting his features. "You bitch!" he screamed. "You lying bitch!" I stepped out of my corner then. I'd taken self-defense classes in college, something my parents had mocked as paranoid and unnecessary. I waited until Mason was close enough, until his hand was raised to strike Riley the same way he'd struck me. Then I moved. The pepper spray I'd carried in my purse for months came out in a smooth motion. The stream caught him directly in the face. Mason went down screaming, clawing at his eyes. I stood over him, Riley at my side, and I felt powerful for the first time in my entire life. "Don't ever touch my partner again," I said quietly. The sirens started, then growing louder as they approached. Agent Morrison had timed it perfectly. The police cars and IRS vehicles pulled up outside their lights, painting the mansion walls in red and blue. I'd invited them myself, of course. I'd given them copies of everything had walked them through every crime, every fraudulent transaction. Federal charges for wire fraud, tax, evasion, money laundering. In the United States, these weren't minor offences. These were spent the next decade in federal prison offences. The police came through the door badges out, reading Mason his rights, while he still writhed on the floor. My father tried to intervene, pulling out his phone to call in favours, but Agent Morrison cut him off. Gregory Ellison, Valerie Ellison, you're also being detained for questioning regarding conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. I watched my mother's face collapse, watched her turn to me with tears streaming down her carefully made-up cheeks. "Harper, please," she begged. "You can't do this to your own family." Something inside me, some final thread of guilt and obligation, snapped cleanly in two. I looked at her and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "You're right," I said. "I can't do this to my own family. But you stopped being my family the moment you chose him over me, every single time. My father tried a different approach." "You're making a mistake," he said in his lawyer voice, even as the police officer was putting him in handcuffs. "Without us, you're nothing. This company will fail, you'll fail." "The company's in my name," I told him calmly. "And Riley's, it always has been. You just never bothered to check the actual incorporation documents. You were so busy putting Mason's name on everything else you forgot that the only thing that legally matters is what's filed with the state of Illinois." I'd learned from the best, after all. My father had taught me to read contracts, to understand legal language, to always protect myself. He just never thought I'd use those skills against him. "The house, the cars, your retirement accounts, everything will be seized to pay restitution to the company," Agent Morrison informed them. "You might want to call that lawyer now." I watched them being led out one by one. Mason still screaming about the pepper spray, demanding a lawyer, threatening lawsuits he'd never be able to afford. My mother crying my father's face like stone. They passed by me in the foyer, and I raised my wine glass in a silent toast. The party guests had scattered like cockroaches when the lights came on. Only a few remained people I barely knew watching with horrified fascination. Let them watch. Let them tell everyone what they'd seen. Let the story spread through Naperville's social circles, through the country clubs and charity galas. Let everyone know what the Ellison family really was. Riley put her arm around my shoulders. "How do you feel?" I thought about the question. I'd expected to feel triumphant, victorious, maybe even guilty. Instead, I felt light, like a weight I'd carried for 33 years had finally been lifted. "I feel free," I said. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, depositions, meetings with lawyers and federal agents. Mason's trial was fast, the evidence overwhelming. He got 10 years in federal prison, no parole for white-collar crime of this magnitude. The judge called his actions a betrayal of trust that went beyond simple greed. My parents avoided prison time by agreeing to pay massive fines and restitution, but they lost everything else. The mansion was sold at auction. The luxury cars, the country club membership, the vacation home in Florida, all of it gone. They moved to a cramped apartment in a less fashionable part of town, and according to mutual acquaintances, they spent most of their time blaming each other for their fall. I didn't visit, I didn't call, I had nothing left to say to them. North Peak Media survived the scandal barely. Riley and I spent weeks doing damage control personally, calling every client, every investor, explaining what had happened, showing them the evidence that we'd been victims of the fraud as much as anyone. Most of them stayed. Some even increased their contracts, impressed by how we'd handled the situation. But Chicago felt poisoned now, tainted by everything that had happened. Riley and I started talking about a fresh start, about taking the company somewhere new, where we could rebuild without constantly looking over our shoulders. "Austin," Riley suggested one night as we worked late in the office. "It's the new tech hub. Lower cost of living, better talent pool, less winter." "You hate the heat," I reminded her. "I hate your family more," she said with a grin. "And they're not in Austin." We made the move in June, relocating the company to a renovated warehouse space in East Austin. The employees who wanted to come with us did, and we hired new talent from the local universities, young people who were hungry and creative, and reminded me of who Riley and I had been when we started. The company took off in ways it never had in Chicago. Without Mason's toxicity poisoning everything, without the constant drain of covering his mistakes, we thrived. By September, we'd landed 3 major contracts, including one with a streaming service that wanted us to produce original content. The kind of deal I dreamed about back when we were working out of my studio apartment. On a warm evening in late October, exactly 1 year after Mason had slapped me in that conference room, Riley and I sat in our new office signing the contracts that would take North Peak Media to the next level. Both our names at the bottom, equal partners, equal owners. "Do you ever regret it?" Riley asked. "Burning it all down?" I thought about the question, really considered it. Did I regret destroying my family, watching my brother go to prison, leaving my parents penniless and bitter? No, I said honestly. They made their choices. They chose cruelty over kindness, greed over integrity, Mason over me. Every single time, I just made sure they faced consequences for those choices. Some people would say you should have been the bigger person, forgiven them. Some people have never been slapped in the face by their own brother while their family watched and did nothing. I set down my pen, looked at Riley. I spent 33 years being the bigger person, being patient, being understanding, sacrificing what I wanted for what they demanded. And it was never enough. It was never going to be enough. Riley raised her glass of champagne. To being exactly the right size person, she toasted. No bigger, no smaller, just perfectly ourselves. We clinked glasses and looked out the window at the Austin skyline, at the city that had welcomed us, at the future we'd built from the ashes of the past. I thought about the girl I'd been a year ago, standing in that corner at the New Year's Eve party, letting her family mock her. I thought about all the years I'd wasted trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. I thought about the price I'd paid for my freedom and the price they'd paid for their cruelty. And I realised something important. This story isn't about revenge, not really. Revenge would have been petty small, focused on making them hurt the way they'd hurt me. No, this was about justice, about refusing to let them win just because they were family, just because that's how it had always been. I'd learned that you don't owe loyalty to people who use it as a weapon against you. You don't owe forgiveness to people who aren't sorry. And you don't owe family anything just because you share DNA. What you owe yourself is protection, respect, the courage to walk away from people who hurt you even when it's hard, even when they tell you you're wrong to do it. My phone buzzed with an email notification, another potential client, another opportunity. Riley was already pulling up their website, talking excitedly about ideas for their campaign. This was my life now, the one I'd chosen, the one I'd fought for. And it was better than anything my family could have given me. They say you can't choose your family, and that's true. But you can choose whether to let them destroy you. You can choose to protect yourself, to value yourself, to build a life they have no power over. That's what I chose, and I've never looked back. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had to walk away from family? Have you ever been in a situation where loyalty meant sacrificing yourself? What would you do if you found out someone you loved was systematically destroying your life? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own boundaries and relationships, hit that like button. Subscribe for more real stories about people who refused to be victims, who fought back, who rebuilt their lives from nothing. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let them win.